At 0219 UTC, the captain of Japan Airlines Flight 1628 keyed the microphone and asked Anchorage Center if any traffic showed at 7 o'clock above. The Boeing 747 freighter was level at flight level 350, north of the Alaska border, and the three crew members had just noticed lights ahead that did not match the usual pattern of navigation beacons. The controller answered that the scope showed nothing in that sector. 30 seconds later, the captain reported two sets of lights directly in front of the aircraft, roughly a mile ahead, and at the same altitude. The lights appeared white and yellow, with a strobe effect, and carried no red. The controller asked for color and position again. The captain repeated the description. The exchange remained short and procedural. No call sign or identification came back over the frequency. The 747 continued south at Mach 0.84. The lights held their place relative to the nose. Inside the cockpit, the crew watched the same fixed bearing while the aircraft flew through clear night air. The weather radar displayed a return between 7 and 8 miles. The controller checked with the Regional Operations Command Center and with Fairbanks approach. Neither facility had a military flight or a civilian aircraft in the sector. The captain asked once more whether anything else appeared on radar. The answer stayed the same, only the 747. The primary return the controller now picked up sat approximately 5 miles behind the freighter at the 6 o'clock position. The captain confirmed the lights remained ahead at 11 o'clock, 8 miles, same level. The controller instructed the ROCC to maintain a track and to verify that no military traffic operated in the area. The reply came back negative. No aircraft were known to be airborne in that block of airspace. The 747 pressed on. The lights stayed visible from the cockpit windows, steady in bearing while the aircraft covered ground at cruise speed. The crew kept the radar display under watch as the controller continued to query other positions for any trace of the contact. Captain Terauchi later noted the two sets of lights appeared joined as one object roughly the size of a 747 or larger, showing yellow, amber, and green with a rotating beacon but no red navigation lights. The onboard radar held the return steady at 7 to 8 miles. The controller directed another check with the ROCC for any code or track. The military facility again reported nothing operating in the block. The freighter maintained altitude and heading, while the unknown lights held their relative position. Anchorage Center asked the crew to confirm the bearing once more. The captain stated the lights had moved slightly to the 10 o'clock position at 10 miles. The controller noted a primary return near the aircraft and asked Fairbanks whether any target appeared alongside the 747. Fairbanks replied that the Japan Air flight was the only target on their scope. The flight had originated in Paris, with a stop in Keflavik to top off the cargo. A shipment of French wine filled both the main deck and the lower holds of the 747-200 freighter, and the short polar leg to Anchorage was chosen to keep the temperature-sensitive load moving without an extended ground delay. Captain Kenju Terauchi, First Officer Takanori Tamafuji, and Flight Engineer Yoshio Tsukuda took the airplane out of Keflavik at 2042 local time on the evening of 17 November. The runway was clear, and the temperature hovered just above freezing. They climbed southeast of Greenland, crossed the ice cap under a nearly full moon that rose on the right front quarter, then turned west across the Canadian Arctic. At Single Point, they checked in with Edmonton Center and received a direct clearance to Fort Yukon. From there, the route followed Jet 125 through the Nenana area and on to Talkeetna before the final descent into Anchorage. The inertial navigation system steered the autopilot. The crew monitored the fuel and engine instruments on the dark polar leg and watched the thin, broken cloud layer slide beneath them over the mountains. North of the Alaska boundary, the sky ahead stayed empty. The sun had set hours earlier, and the moon now lay low behind the tail. At 4:25 p.m., Alaska time, the 747 crossed Patat intersection and entered the ADIZ. The aircraft was level at flight level 390, Mach 0.84, with Anchorage Center handling the handoff. Terauchi later noted that nothing on the pre-flight paperwork or the first hours of the crossing had indicated any traffic would be sharing that block of airspace. The three men settled into the routine of a cargo flight, the wine secured below, the northern horizon featureless except for the faint glow of Fairbanks still more than 200 miles ahead. The captain kept the aircraft on the assigned track while the first officer cross-checked the inertial units against the high-frequency radio fixes, Fuel flow remained steady at the planned rate for the polar routing. The flight engineer logged the engine parameters every 30 minutes as required. Outside the windows, the ice cap gave way to the dark Canadian tundra, then to the Brooks Range. No other aircraft appeared on the weather radar or in the forward view. The crew had flown this leg before on similar cargo rotations and expected the same empty radio calls and steady autopilot inputs until the descent began near Talkeetna. Anchorage Center accepted the handoff from Edmonton and issued a clearance to proceed direct to Fort Yukon, then onward via the published airway. The 747 maintained flight level 390 without deviation. The captain adjusted the cockpit lighting to preserve night vision and scanned the horizon for any sign of other traffic. The moon had dropped below the tail, leaving only starlight on the wing. The wine in the hold stayed within the required temperature band, because the short Arctic crossing avoided prolonged exposure on the ramp at either end. The captain first picked up the lights at roughly 30 degrees left of the nose, 2,000 feet below the 747, and holding the same heading and speed. They showed as two distinct clusters, steady enough that at first he took them for a pair of military aircraft on a parallel track. Minutes passed, and the separation never opened or closed. The first officer keyed the radio and asked Anchorage Center for traffic in the area. The controller checked the scope and answered negative. Terauchi described what he saw as navigation lights and a strobe, white and yellow, with no red visible on either set. The controller passed the report to the Regional Operations Command Center and asked for a primary search. The military radar picked up a single return about 5 miles behind the 747, held it briefly, then lost it again. Fairbanks approach reported only the Japan Air flight on its scope. The light stayed fixed relative to the 747 for several more minutes. Then the two clusters changed arrangement. What had been side by side became one above the other, and the whole formation slid leftward until it sat off the port wing. Terauchi switched the weather radar to a 20-mile scale, set the tilt to the horizon, and the scope painted a solid green return at 7 to 8 miles, exactly where the lights now rode. The return was large and round on the screen, unlike the usual red returns the radar gave for other aircraft. Anchorage Center confirmed again that nothing appeared on the ground radar at that position. Inside the cockpit, the light level rose. Terauchi later wrote that the brightness reached his face, and that he felt a distinct warmth across his skin, while the object held station off the wing. The first officer and flight engineer both confirmed the same shift in position and intensity. No warning lights illuminated on the overhead panel, and the instruments remained steady. The VHF radios carried occasional static, but stayed readable. The 747 continued at Mach 0.84, the lights pacing it exactly. The radar return locked at the same range. Terauchi judged the object comparable in size to a 747 or larger, based on the radar distance and the span of the lights. He noted the absence of any red navigation lights and the presence of a rotating beacon among the yellow, amber, and green points. The formation maintained its new vertical stack off the left wing without further movement. Anchorage Center kept the Japan Air 747 on frequency, while the Regional Operations Command Center at Murphy Dome compared its military radar picture with the civilian scopes. The 747 had already reported the lights holding position off the left wing at the same altitude and speed. Controllers passed the crew's description of white and yellow strobes forward and asked the military site to check for any traffic near the aircraft's reported locations south of Fort Yukon. The ROC operator scanned the sector and noted an intermittent primary return that appeared roughly 5 miles behind the 747 before shifting several miles off its left side. The military radar showed no secondary beacon code on the new contact. The operator confirmed no scheduled military flights were operating in the area at that time. Within 2 sweeps, the primary return vanished from the scope. Fairbanks approach reported only the single transponder return from Flight 1628 on its display. Anchorage relayed the information back to the crew and requested the ROC continue watching the sector. The primary return reappeared moments later, this time near the 10 o'clock position at the same flight level as the 747. The ROC again identified the contact as unknown and lost it on the next sweep. The sequence repeated several times over the next minutes, each appearance brief and without any matching beacon code. The captain requested descent to flight level 310. Anchorage issued clearance at pilot's discretion. As the 747 began its step-down, the military radar acquired another primary return near the aircraft, held it for 2 sweeps, and dropped it again. Fairbanks continued to display nothing except the Japan Air 747. The ROC was asked to maintain whatever track it could and to confirm once more that no military aircraft were present. The reply remained negative on both counts. During level off at the new altitude, the crew reported the lights still visible off the left wing, maintaining station. The military radar picked up the primary return a final time and described it as large and slow-moving before losing contact once more. Fairbanks confirmed it still saw only the single target belonging to the 747. The pattern of short acquisitions followed by immediate loss continued, without any secondary return appearing on either military or civilian scopes except the one from the Japan Air flight itself. South of Fairbanks, the western horizon held only a narrow band of fading light, while the sky to the east stayed fully black. The two smaller objects that had tracked off the left wing appeared to merge or be overtaken by a single, much larger form. Against that dark background, the outline resolved into a broad squared shape, whose lower edge carried a steady row of lights. Captain Terauchi later recorded that the object measured roughly twice the length of the 747 and remained slightly above and ahead at the 10 o'clock position. The crew had already told Anchorage Center about the smaller lights. Now the captain keyed the microphone and asked for a heading change that would take the flight directly toward Talkeetna. The controller approved the request without adding any traffic information. The 747 banked left and settled onto the new track. City lights from Fairbanks and the Eelson runway complex passed on the right side, while the eastern sky offered no other reference except the dark silhouette. Inside the cockpit, the weather radar continued to show a solid return at 7 to 8 miles. The captain asked the controller whether ground radar held anything at that range. The reply came back negative except for the brief primary contacts noted earlier. No secondary transponder return appeared on either civilian or military scopes. The crew kept the object in view as the aircraft flew level at 35,000 feet. The shape stayed steady relative to the 747 even after the course change. Terauchi had set the aircraft weather radar to a 20-mile scale and horizon angle before the large return appeared. The display showed a green circular target at the same bearing as the visual sighting. He noted that the return remained consistent, while the smaller lights had already faded from the scopes. The transcript shows the crew again asked Anchorage whether ground radar could confirm the contact. The answer remained the same. Only intermittent primary hits registered, each lasting only seconds. The military ROC continued to monitor the area, but produced no matching beacon code. The 747 crossed the Tanana Valley with the dark mass still visible outside the cockpit windows. Anchorage Center instructed the Japan Air 747 to begin a right 360-degree turn for identification. The captain read back the clearance and rolled the aircraft into a standard bank. The heavy wings tilted and the nose tracked steadily across the dark sky while the crew kept the object fixed in the left windows. Its row of lights held the same angle relative to the wing throughout the turn. The aircraft radar continued to show the return at 7 or 8 miles, with no change in range or bearing. Ground radar displayed only the same brief primary contacts that appeared and vanished within a few sweeps. The captain maintained visual contact as the heading swept through the compass. When the wings leveled on the original track, the controller asked if the traffic had matched the maneuver. The captain reported the object remained in the same position off the left side. The crew then requested descent from flight level 350 to 310. Anchorage approved the lower altitude and the 747 began a gradual descent. The object stayed visible through the first stages of the drop, its lights keeping the same geometry against the night sky. Terauchi noted the shape appeared large and rounded on the weather radar display set to 20 miles. The descent continued without any shift in the contact's relative position. The Regional Operations Command Center reported an intermittent primary target 5 miles behind the 747 on some sweeps and farther on others. No transponder code was associated with the return. The controller passed the information to the flight and asked whether the crew wanted a military scramble. The captain answered negative and repeated the word. The 747 kept descending toward flight level 250, while the primary return stayed in trail on the military scope. Anchorage issued clearance for the new altitude and the aircraft leveled there. At flight level 250, the object remained in sight for several minutes. Its lights maintained constant spacing relative to the wing before the crew reported they could no longer see it. Anchorage Center turned United 69 onto a vector that would bring the northbound 747 within 5 miles of the Japan Air flight. The controller told the United crew the Japan Air 747 was southbound at flight level 310 and carried traffic at its 9 o'clock position at the same altitude. United 69 acknowledged and began closing the distance. The controller asked Japan Air 1628 to flash its landing lights on and off, so the approaching aircraft could confirm the target. Terauchi complied. At roughly 50 miles, the United crew reported the first visual contact. They described a 747 silhouetted against the remaining twilight glow on the western horizon, its contrail stretching behind it in a clear line. The lights flashed as instructed. United 69 stated they had the Japan airliner in sight and would continue to watch for anything flying with it. The controller repeated the reported position of the traffic, 7 to 8 o'clock 10 miles in trail. United answered that they were still looking and asked for a tighter vector. The two heavy jets passed within visual range. United 69 reported the Japan Air 747 clearly, its shape and contrail unmistakable against the pale sky. No second aircraft appeared at the 9 o'clock position or anywhere else near the 747. The United crew stated they saw nothing else, no lights, no shape, no object matching the description the Japan air captain had given. The controller acknowledged the report and kept United on the vector a short while longer before releasing them. By 0253, the Japan air crew reported the lights they had been tracking were no longer visible. The object that had held position off their left side for the better part of an hour had simply vanished from their windows. The primary returns that had flickered behind the 747 on the military scope had already faded minutes earlier. United 69 continued northward, its crew having seen only the Japan Air 747 and an empty patch of sky where the reported traffic should have been. Totem 71 accepted the vector from Anchorage Center and descended to 24,000 feet. The C-130 turned west of the airway and closed on the Japan Air 747 from the right side. After 0250, its crew acquired the four-engine jet as a clear silhouette against the last light on the horizon. They held station a few miles out and scanned the sky behind the airliner. Their own radar showed no additional returns. The controller held them in place while United 69 continued north on the airway. The transport remained steady at the assigned altitude, with its navigation lights steady against the dark. The C-130 crew reported the Japan airliner in sight and nothing trailing it. They saw no lights or shape at the 9 o'clock position the 747 had described. Their scope stayed clear of any contact at the same altitude or in trail. The controller asked them to maintain position for another minute. The four-engine turboprop held its heading and confirmed the view remained empty except for the descending 747. No military or civilian traffic appeared on their instruments or through the side windows. The sky behind the airliner stayed featureless under the remaining twilight. After the minute passed, the controller released Totem 71 direct to Elmendorf. The transport banked left and climbed away from the airway. Its crew made no further calls about traffic. Japan Air 1628 continued its descent through the flight levels. At 0253, the 747 checked in with Anchorage approach and began stepping down toward the outer marker. After landing at Anchorage, the crew stepped from the 747 into a small office where FAA security officers waited. Jim Derry, Ron Mickle, and Jack Wright sat with Captain Terauchi, First Officer Tamafuji, and Flight Engineer Sakuda. The men took handwritten notes as the pilots described yellow, amber, and green lights without red, two sets that appeared joined, and a color radar return holding steady at 7 to 8 miles. The notes recorded the object shifting from ahead to the left side and remaining there for 35 minutes. They also logged the 360-degree turn near Fairbanks, during which the return stayed fixed on the port side while the Japan airliner flew through clear air at flight level 390. The crew reported static on VHF frequencies and said the target broke off roughly 40 miles north of Talkeetna. The interviewers noted no sign of drugs or alcohol and described the men as consistent and professional throughout the session. Terauchi supplied drawings of the light configuration and later added a silhouette. Those pages and the typed summaries went straight into the folder alongside the controller transcripts and the C-130 log that showed only the airliner and empty sky. In early January 1987, Terauchi submitted a longer translated statement that expanded the account. It described two smaller objects stopping in front of the cockpit, illuminating the interior, and producing a sensation of warmth, followed by the larger silhouette that stayed with the aircraft after the Fairbanks turn. That document joined the growing package of radar plots, interview notes, and the original flight data recorder readout. On 5 March 1987, the FAA released the full set of materials to the public. The package contained controller transcripts, the Anchorage interview notes, Terauchi's statement, radar plots, and a summary that stated the agency could not confirm a second aircraft or object matching the crew's description. Initial press reports had carried claims of radar confirmation for an additional target. The release documents clarified that the returns were uncorrelated and later attributed to a split image of the 747 itself. FAA radar specialists at the Technical Center in Atlantic City loaded the recorded tapes from the Murphy Dome site and stepped through the returns frame by frame. The second blip that had appeared near JAL 1628 was not a separate aircraft. It was the same 747 producing two signals that the computer placed in adjacent range cells. The primary skin return from the fuselage arrived a fraction of a second after the transponder reply, so the system registered them as uncorrelated targets, roughly a quarter-mile apart. The same split image effect showed up on other flights passing through the same sector that night. No second aircraft track consistent with the size or movement the crew described ever appeared on the regenerated plots. The FAA release noted that controllers had worked from the live scope and had to treat the extra return as real traffic while it lasted. Once the data were replayed with full timing information, the second return vanished and the single 747 track remained. The agency added that no radar evidence supported an object matching the visual report of a large dark shape with multiple colored lights. At the time of the sighting, Jupiter sat low in the southeast, bright enough to stand out against the twilight sky, with Mars visible a short distance away. Later reviews pointed out that the planet's position lined up with the direction the captain first reported the lights. Ice crystals in the temperature inversion layer at 23,500 feet were also suggested as a possible reflector for ground lights or the planet itself, though the crew described the object moving independently and changing altitude relative to the 747. When the three crew members were interviewed separately weeks after landing, their accounts diverged in detail. Terauchi's written statement included the silhouette size, the sensation of warmth inside the cockpit, and the object's precise placement in the darkest part of the sky. The first officer and flight engineer described the lights but gave no measurements of the dark shape and did not mention any change in cockpit temperature. Neither repeated the claim that the object had deliberately stayed on the night side of the aircraft. The radio calls made during the flight contained none of these later specifics. They reported lights, a radar contact on the onboard set, and a request for traffic information. United 69 and the Air Force C-130 that passed nearby were both asked to look. Their crews reported seeing only the 747. The C-130 pilot stated he had a clear view of the Japanese aircraft and nothing else in formation with it. The 747 landed at Anchorage at about 0323 UTC, which was still the evening of November 17th in Alaska. The airplane rolled in as an ordinary cargo arrival, but the paper trail was already forming behind it. FAA personnel met the crew at Anchorage and took notes, while Terauchi, Tamafuji, and Tsukuda went back through the route, the lights, the radar return, the 360-degree turn, and the point north of Talkeetna where the contact finally disappeared. The notes did not describe damaged equipment or injured crew. They described a professional flight crew trying to put impossible-looking traffic into the language of air safety. The tape at Anchorage Center preserved the cooler version of the story. It held the first question about traffic, the controller's negative answer, the calls to ROC and Fairbanks, the intermittent primary returns, the offer to scramble military aircraft, and the refusal. It held United 69 reporting the Japan Air 747 in sight with no airplane around it. It held Totem 71 confirming the same emptiness. The transcript did not give the object a shape. It gave the timeline a skeleton, and that skeleton was enough for the case to keep moving. Weeks later, Terauchi's longer statement added the body back onto that skeleton. It brought in the warmth on his face, the lights that seemed to stop in front of the cockpit, the large dark form after Fairbanks, and the fear that made him decline the scramble. Then the FAA technical review took the radar apart and named the split return. The final paper record never verified a separate target moving with the freighter. Skeptical writers added Jupiter, moonlight, ice crystals, and witness differences. None of those explanations needed a cover-up. They only needed ordinary light doing ordinary things in a hard place to judge distance. But the file still leaves one image that does not sit quietly. A loaded 747 crosses black Alaska with the moon low behind it. In the cockpit, three men watch lights hold a bearing where no traffic should be. On the ground, controllers ask other scopes to look. Another airliner sees only the freighter. A military transport sees only the freighter. Months later, the paper says, split target, bright planet, ice. And still, if you picture that flight deck at 0219 UTC, the first sound is not an explanation. It is a captain on the radio asking whether anybody else is out there.